Today we're going to talk about images in HTML. Now you can see here I have a basic HTML document set up with all the basic skeleton code, and I have a link to a CSS style sheet, and we're just going to get started. So if we want to use an image in HTML, just like with anything else, we need to choose the appropriate element. And in this case, the appropriate element is, funnily enough, the image element, IMG. So it's a self-closing element. We don't need a separate closing tag for this element. But if we save this and look in the browser, you can see we still don't see anything. And the reason is we're saying that we need an image here, but we haven't pointed to any image file. To do so, we're going to need to add an attribute to this image element called source, src. And just as with most attributes, we're going to do equals and then quotation marks where we're going to put the value. And I have a couple of image files already placed in my root directory or project folder. So I can just refer to one of them by name. So I can say Mr. Cat large.jpg. And now if I hit save, we see this image is loading right where I've put the image element. Now, this is a large image file. In fact, it's 1,000 pixels wide. So you can see that it's huge in the browser because it shows the image at the actual file size of the image file. Now, we could adjust that with CSS, but it's also important to make sure you are loading images that are the appropriate size for what you're trying to do. So I actually have another version of it called Mr. Cat Small. Let's refer to that one instead. And now we can see that this one is sized to the actual smaller file size, and that's how it displays in the browser. So you want to be sure to choose an image file that is the appropriate size for the use in your web layout. Now, I've used a JPEG image. Other common image formats on the web are PNG, GIF, and SVG. There are a number of image file types that aren't supported by most web browsers, so you want to be sure you're using a supported file type. So now we've referenced our image and it's showing up in the browser. Notice here that I just have my images in my root folder. And if I have a lot of images in my project, that might get kind of cluttered. So what I want to do is drag my images into this images subfolder that I've made here. So this is a subfolder within my root folder. So I'm just going to drag those images in there. And now let's see what happens if we reload the browser. We can see the image is no longer loading, and so we can't see the image anymore. Well, this shows us a couple things we need to be aware of. First, when you're writing this source attribute, you need to point to the image file where it actually is in your file system. So at first, just pointing to the file name worked because the file was in the same folder as the HTML file in which I'm writing it. But since I've put it in a subfolder, I now need to reference the name of that folder. So I'm just going to write the name of the folder and then slash and then the file name. So images slash mrcatsmall.jpg. That means we're going to look in a folder called images for a file called mrcat.jpg. And now if I save it, we can see that it does again load in the browser. We could do any file path we could imagine. We could have a subfolder within a subfolder within a subfolder. As long as we wrote the name of each of those subfolders in our file path, it would find the file as long as the names were correct and the order was correct, and they would be used. So I'm just going to leave this here, images mrcatsmall.jpg. Another thing that we saw when this file path broke and it didn't load is we had no idea what image we were missing. So if I purposefully break the file path again by getting rid of the folder name, we can see we get a little icon that shows a broken image. So we know there's something here, but we don't know what it should be. So it's a best practice to always include some information for if someone can't see an image. Now, this is one case in which someone can't see an image if the file path is broken and for whatever reason the image file can't be found. Another reason might be if a user has a vision impairment of some kind and can't use the browser visually, but has to use a screen reader, which reads the content out loud for them. We want to make sure that they're also getting some kind of experience of the image. So we're going to add another attribute to this image element. So I'm going to hit a space, and the other attribute is called alt, which means alternative text or text that will be read if the image can't be viewed. So I'm just going to say Mr. the Cat. And you can write normally in Alt because it will be read aloud for screen readers, or it can just be read as text for non-screen readers. So here we can see if we reload the browser again, here's the description that I just wrote in place of the broken image. Now, if I fix the image path so that it loads again, images slash, so that's that images folder name, and then the file name, save it, then we just see the image. We don't see that alternative text. So that alternative text is just for when the image can't be viewed by a user for whatever reason. But it's important to always have alt text. So these are the two required attributes for every image. You need an image element, but then you need these attributes. Source, which needs to point to the image in the proper location. So if there's a folder, it should be referred to. And then alt, which provides that alternative text for if the image can't be viewed. Now, there are a few other attributes that are optional and you probably don't need most of the time, but I'll go ahead and show them to you. One of them is the title attribute. Now, the title attribute, just like the alt attribute, can take normal text. I will put a very cute cat here. Now let's see what happens if we load the browser. We don't necessarily see anything that pulls from that text right away, but if I hover my mouse over, I'm going to get a little pop-up, and I don't know if you'll be able to see this in the demo, but you can try it yourself. A little pop-up that gives that text right by my mouse. So it's kind of a little tooltip that has the text that I put in the title attribute. Really, it's not often necessary to have a title attribute. One of the main reasons might be if this image was inside a link and you wanted to give the user some kind of idea of where they were linking to. You can also use them for little jokes, put a little punchline in there. So that's the title attribute. And honestly, the use cases for it are pretty narrow. You don't need it most of the time. The other optional attributes that you don't need most of the time are width and height. Now, you would provide it in pixel values, but you would not write px. So 500 would be 500 wide, 300 would be 300 tall. But honestly, most of the time, there's no real reason to put these. You can size the image using CSS. So these are kind of remnants of the old days when browsers weren't as smart about how they sized images. But I'm just going to go ahead and delete them and say, don't use them. The only ones that you need to have on every image are the source attribute and the alt attribute. So that is the HTML image element. But there's another way that you can add a certain kind of image to your file. And that's if you have an SVG image. Now, SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. And SVGs work pretty differently than how something like a JPEG, which is a raster image, works. A raster image is basically made up of a grid of individual pixels. And if I were to zoom in on this image of the cat, I could see that it was made up of individual little squares of color. Well, SVGs aren't made that way at all. They're made of mathematical shapes. And we can use an SVG file in the image element just like we could use a JPEG or a PNG. But another interesting thing with SVG files is that we can actually place the code from an SVG file directly in our HTML document. And if I hit save, I see this SVG in my file. Now, this SVG is very simple. It's just a star with a circle behind it. And if we look at the SVG code, we can see we've got a circle. So that's our circle. And we can see we've got a polygon. So that's what makes up the shape of that star. Now, the individual parts of the code for the SVG aren't very human friendly, but because we can see these as different elements on the page, we can actually target these with CSS and edit them with CSS. So I could use CSS to change the colors or add animation even to the individual parts of this SVG, which is pretty powerful. And this is a very simple SVG, but if I wanted to, I could paste a very complex SVG in here as well. And you can see this one has a lot of different parts to it, and it makes up this more complicated image. But if I wanted to, I could figure out which part of the SVG made up which individual part of this image, and I could animate them or change colors or do whatever I wanted using CSS. So this technique is called inline SVG, where you paste SVG code directly into an HTML file. So just to recap, if we want to use an image in HTML, we need to use the image element, which is a self-closing element. Then on that element, we need to place the source attribute, which will point to the image file that we want to use. We can use JPEG images, PNG images, GIF images, or SVG images. And we need to be careful to make sure that our file path that we've written matches where the file is in our file structure. We also need to always be sure that we provide an alt attribute. And this is the text that will be used if the image can't be seen for whatever reason, whether that's because the image file didn't load or because a user is using a screen reader to read a website aloud to them. There are a few optional attributes that we can place on an image element, including the title attribute, which will show a little pop up text when you hover your mouse over an image, or the width and height attributes, which show what size the image is. But really, those aren't needed very often anymore, and you should avoid them unless you have a particular reason to use them. Finally, we can paste SVG code directly into an HTML document using a technique called inline SVG, which just means we're pasting that code right in there. And what's useful about that is we can identify individual parts of the SVG and use CSS to recolor them, animate them, resize them, whatever we want to do. So that is images in HTML.